I never thought I'd be telling this story, especially now when everything has changed beyond recognition. But when you see your world crumbling before your eyes, when people you trusted are revealed to be part of the system that killed your daughter, you realize you can't remain silent any longer. What I learned that day at the Babel complex, what I downloaded from their servers, these aren't just secret files. They're the truth about who we really are. And this truth is so monstrous that I still wake up in a cold sweat, hoping it was all just a nightmare. It all began 3 years ago on Colony SC-214. The place was so remote from civilization that even the coordinates seemed like a random string of numbers. We lived there in a small community, about 200 people, mostly miners and their families. The work was hard, but honest. We mined rare earth metals for the corporations that were building their glittering cities on Earth and Mars. We were promised regular deliveries of medicine, food, and equipment. They promised that our children would receive an education, that we would one day be able to return home with our savings. My daughter Lisa was a teenager then, 14 years old, full of life and plans. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, wanted to help people. I often caught myself thinking that she was so much better than me. Kinder, smarter, fairer. After my wife died, Lisa was all I had left. We spent evenings studying old medical textbooks she'd found somewhere. She asked endless questions about the human body, about illnesses, about how medicines worked. Then she got sick. At first, it looked like a common cold. Cough, fever, weakness. But as the days went by, she only got worse. Our colonial medic, good old Dr. Hansen, was a good man, but his knowledge and equipment were limited. He said it could be a serious infection, perhaps some local disease to which we had no immunity. We needed specialized antibiotics, modern diagnostic equipment, maybe even evacuation to Earth or Mars. I sent urgent requests through official channels. The prison's medical service responded with the standard phrases, "Your request has been received for review. Please expect a response within 7 business days." 7 days became 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned into a month. Lisa grew weaker with each passing day. She could no longer get out of bed, tormented by coughing fits that left her choking. At night, I sat next to her, holding her hand and praying to any god who would listen. Other colonists began to fall ill too. First children, then adults. Dr. Hansen worked around the clock, but could only alleviate the symptoms. His supplies were quickly running low and new shipments weren't arriving. When I contacted the transport service, I was told the medical shipment was stuck at one of the transfer stations due to administrative procedures. When I asked what that meant, the line went dead. I began digging deeper. I contacted other colonies, searched public databases, and tried to figure out what was happening with the supplies. What I discovered made my blood boil. Medical supplies were regularly shipped from production centers, but somewhere along the way, they disappeared. Officially, they were written off as lost in transit or damaged in an accident. In reality, these medications were being resold on the black market in wealthy areas of Earth and Mars, where people were willing to pay any price for quality medications. While I was searching for the truth, Lisa was dying. In her final days, she barely regained consciousness. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at me with such understanding, as if she knew what was happening, but didn't blame me for my helplessness. She died quietly one February evening while a sandstorm raged outside. Her last words were a plea not to blame myself and a promise to wait for me. The funeral took place in complete silence. The entire colony came to pay their respects to Liza, but no one knew what to say. What can you say to a father who lost his daughter to someone else's greed? Dr. Hansen cried as much as I did. He knew he could have saved her if he'd had the right medicine. After the funeral, I locked myself in my home and didn't come out for 2 weeks. Neighbors brought food, knocked on the door, offered help, but I didn't want anything, just for the pain to go away. When I finally emerged, I was a changed man. Grief had turned to rage, and rage to cold determination. I continued my investigation, no longer for Lisa's sake, but for the sake of all the children who could have died the same way. What I discovered exceeded my wildest expectations. This wasn't just corruption. It was an entire system built on the suffering of ordinary people. Medical supplies were just the tip of the iceberg. Food, equipment, life support parts, all were regularly lost en route to the colonies. Taxes were collected dutifully from remote settlements, but the money ended up in the pockets of officials and corporate bosses. People on the fringes of the system worked like slaves, ensuring the wealth of the elite, and in return received promises no one intended to keep. But worst of all, I learned about the organ trade. When colonists died from disease or accidents, their bodies weren't given a proper burial. Special teams would arrive and collect biological material for scientific research. In reality, the organs of healthy people accustomed to hard work in extreme conditions were highly prized on the black market. Rich people from Earth were willing to pay millions for a new heart or liver from a hardy miner. I realized my daughter's body could have been taken too. The thought nearly drove me crazy. I rushed to the cemetery and dug up her grave with my bare hands. Luckily, it was still there. Apparently, children's organs were less valuable, or someone had been kind. But how many other families didn't even know their loved ones weren't buried in the ground? That's when I met Douglas. It happened in the Ashen Cantina at the transit station, where I'd arrived to pick up parts for our equipment. I was sitting in the corner, drinking cheap synthetic alcohol, and plotting how to get to those responsible for Lisa's death. Douglas sat down next to me without an invitation. A tall, thin man with tired eyes and a scar on his left cheek. He said he knew who I was and what had happened to me. At first, I thought he was a corporate security agent or a government spy. But then he showed me the documents I'd been searching for months. The exact routes of medical supplies, the names of officials who had received bribes, photographs of warehouses where the lost medications were stored. He had information not only about our colony, but about dozens of other settlements throughout the system. Douglas told me about Lost Sanctuary, an organization of people who had also lost everything to the corruption and greed of the elite. Some were colonists like me. Others were former corporate employees who could no longer remain silent about what they had seen. We were all united by a common goal, to stop this system and show the people the truth. He invited me to join them. He said they were planning an operation that could change everything. They were supposed to infiltrate one of the Illuminous Corporation's most secure facilities and steal information that would prove their crimes to the world. It was a dangerous mission, and my chances of survival were slim. But it didn't matter to me. I'd already lost everything that mattered to me. The next 6 months were spent in preparation. I was taught how to work with computer systems, network protocols, and security systems. Before this, I had been a simple miner, my skills limited to operating drilling rigs and repairing machinery. Now I was to become a hacker and a spy. The training took place at the secret Lost Sanctuary base, hidden in an asteroid belt. It was an old mining complex abandoned after its deposits were depleted. From the outside, it looked dead, but inside, life was thriving. Hundreds of people worked around the clock. Programmers, engineers, former military personnel, doctors. All were united by a single idea: to end the system that had turned humanity into a commodity. A new identity and documents were created for me. I was now Joseph Clark, a technician from Mars who had moved to Earth in search of a better life. The cover story was carefully crafted. I had a work history, an education history, even fake memories from acquaintances who could corroborate my past. Plastic surgery had altered my facial features, and my vocal cords had been modified to alter the timbre of my voice. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. Getting a job at Illuminous turned out to be easier than expected. The corporation was always in need of qualified technical specialists, especially those willing to work in remote facilities for a low salary. My fake resume made an impression, and the references from former colleagues finally convinced the HR department. 2 weeks later, I was already working at the Babel facility near Sarajevo. Babel was an impressive structure, a vast underground complex extending several kilometers underground. Above were administrative buildings and employee quarters, while below were laboratories, server rooms, and production facilities. Security was top-notch: retinal scanners, biometric locks, and patrols of cyborg praetorians who could detect the slightest deviations in personnel behavior. For the first few months, I worked as a regular technician, maintaining equipment, repairing computers, and helping with the network infrastructure. My colleagues were friendly, especially Glenn and Edwin, with whom I often ate lunch in the communal cafeteria. They talked about their families, vacation plans, and complained about the bureaucracy. They were ordinary people, just doing their jobs and not asking unnecessary questions. I diligently played the role of a happy employee, I smiled, participated in corporate events, and even had a brief affair with a girl from HR. All this time, I was studying the complex's internal structure, memorizing patrol schedules, and plotting a plan to infiltrate the D3N server cluster, where Illuminus's most sensitive data was stored. Communication with Lost Sanctuary was maintained through encrypted messages hidden in regular work files. Once a week, I received short instructions or questions about the complex's security. Gradually, I realized something big was afoot. Not just information theft, but a full-scale attack on Babel. On August 19th, 3288, I woke up with a feeling it would be a special day. Dawn was breaking outside the window of my small apartment in the residential block. The Babel complex was waking up. The ventilation was turning on, the lights were coming on, the automated systems were starting up. I took a shower, had a breakfast of synthetic foods from the corporate cafeteria, and headed to work. In the elevator, I met Glenn, who looked worried. He explained that a major system had malfunctioned overnight, and all technical specialists would be called in for emergency repairs. I nodded in understanding, though a tinge of unease welled within me. Any changes to the routine could disrupt the mission. The tech department was in the usual bustle. Edwin sat at his terminal, trying to figure out the cause of the overnight outage, and our boss, Mr. Brower, paced nervously between workstations. I turned on my computer and checked my work email. Among the usual notifications and reports, there was one message that made my heart beat faster. On the surface, it looked like a notification about the need to update software on one of the servers. But to me, it was a code phrase. The plan is being accelerated. The mission must be completed today. Lost Sanctuary received information that a security check would begin tomorrow at the complex, after which it would be impossible to penetrate the server cluster. I spent the morning doing my usual work, trying to remain discreet. I repaired a printer in the accounting department, updated the antivirus software on the workstations, and helped a new employee navigate the corporate network. All the while, I was thinking about the upcoming operation, mentally reviewing the plan and checking that everything was ready. After lunch, I told my colleagues I needed to perform scheduled maintenance on the server equipment in the lower levels of the complex. It was a routine part of my duties, so no one asked any questions. I grabbed my tools and diagnostic equipment and headed for the elevators leading to the secure area. Descending into the depths of Babel always left a dreary impression on me. The deeper you went, the more you felt the pressure of tons of earth and concrete above your head. The corridors became narrower, the lighting dimmer, and the air drier and colder. Guard posts stood at every level, where Praetorians scanned passes and checked documents. The Praetorians were terrifying creatures, cyborgs over 2 meters tall, their human parts long since replaced by mechanical counterparts. Only their brains remained biological, encased in an armored casing. Their eyes glowed red as they scanned visitors, and their voices sounded like the grinding of metal. It was said that the Praetorians were volunteers from corporate security, but I suspected many of them were once ordinary people forced to undergo this procedure. The D3N server cluster was located on the 8th underground level. To get there, one had to pass through 3 checkpoints, each of which required not only a pass but also a retinal scan. Luckily, Lost Sanctuary took care of this. Special contact lenses created the required blood vessel pattern, and the forged documents were indistinguishable from the real thing. The first checkpoint passed without a hitch. The Praetorians scanned my pass, checked my retinas, and let me through. At the second checkpoint, a particularly attentive cyborg was on duty, studying my documents for a long time. I tried to look bored and slightly annoyed, the kind of technician you'd expect when distracted from important work. Finally, he handed me back my documents and opened the door. The third point was the most difficult. There were 2 Praetorians and an additional biometric scanner stationed there. One of the cyborgs asked me to explain the purpose of my visit to the server cluster. I showed a fake work order for a diagnostic of the cooling system and explained that there had been complaints about rising temperatures in the server room. The Praetorian studied the document for a long time, then contacted Control for confirmation. Those few minutes felt like an eternity, but eventually they let me through. The D3N server cluster was a huge room filled with rows of server racks. The hum of fans and the whir of electronics created a constant background noise. The temperature was maintained at 12 degrees Celsius, so I immediately felt the chill. Hundreds of thousands of processors processed Illuminus data, financial transactions, research projects, and senior management correspondence. I quickly found the server I needed and connected my device to it. On the outside, it looked like a regular diagnostic computer, but inside, a program was installed to scan databases and find the necessary information. The download began automatically. The system searched for files related to colonial supplies, medical cargo, and financial transactions. The initial results exceeded my expectations. Illuminus's databases contained detailed reports of lost shipments, lists of officials receiving bribes, and schemes for reselling medications on the black market. There was evidence that the corporation not only knew about the corruption, but was actively involved in it. Medicines were deliberately diverted to wealthy areas where they could be sold at inflated prices, while the colonies received expired medications or nothing at all. But that wasn't all. The system discovered information about mining projects in remote areas of the galaxy. Illuminus planned to create a network of fully automated mines that would operate without human intervention. This meant thousands of colonists would lose their jobs and livelihoods. The corporation knew about this, but the document spoke of reducing personnel costs and increasing production efficiency. Among the files found, one stood out: Project Arendelle. It was the development of a new interstellar travel technology that could revolutionize space navigation. However, access to this technology was planned to be limited to the elite, wealthy corporations and government agencies. Ordinary people would remain trapped in slow and expensive transportation systems. I created a fake delivery order, specifying Project Arendelle as the cargo to be transported. The system automatically encrypted the order and sent it for processing. It will take Illuminus a few hours to decrypt it and understand what's going on, and by then the information will already be in the hands of Lost Sanctuary. As the program continued scanning, I noticed one entry in the file list that caught my attention: Project SIN. The name was far more classified than the rest of the data, and the file size indicated it contained a massive amount of information. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started downloading the file. The first megabytes of data sent a chill through me. Project SIN wasn't just a research project. It was a program to modify human consciousness. Illuminus had developed technology that could alter memories, implant false beliefs, and control people's emotions and behavior. The goal was simple: create a docile population that would unquestioningly submit to corporate interests. Experiments have already been conducted on volunteers, people who believed they were participating in medical research or rehabilitation programs. They were implanted with nanodevices in their brains, which gradually altered the structure of neural connections. The subjects became more submissive, less prone to protest, willing to work for minimal pay, and refrained from asking uncomfortable questions. But the most terrifying thing was that this technology had already begun to be implemented in the colonies. The medications that did reach remote settlements contained nanoparticles that accumulated in the brain. People were unaware that they were becoming guinea pigs in a grand experiment in mind control. I realized that my daughter Lisa might have died not just because of a lack of medication, but because her body rejected the nano implants. Perhaps her immune system recognized the foreign devices and began to fight them, leading to her illness. This meant she died defending her mind from the corporation's invasion. Suddenly, an alarm siren blared in the server room. Red lights flashed throughout the room, and an automated voice announced a security breach in server cluster Osiris. Someone else had attempted to hack into Illuminus's systems but had been detected. I realized it was part of a larger plan. While I was working in D3N, other members of Lost Sanctuary were attacking other servers to distract security. The download of Project SIN wasn't complete yet, but I couldn't wait. I had to leave before I was discovered. The sound of metallic footsteps echoed through the corridors. The Praetorians were rushing toward the alarm. I switched off my device and hid behind one of the server racks. 3 cyborgs entered the room and began a systematic search. Their scanners probed every corner, checking for temperature anomalies, analyzing sounds and vibrations. I crouched low and tried to breathe as quietly as possible. The Praetorians slowly approached my hiding place, their red eyes glowing in the dim light of the server room. Suddenly, a new order came over the loudspeakers. All security forces were to immediately proceed to the Zeta-3 laboratory, where a breach had occurred. The Praetorians stopped, exchanged glances, and quickly left the server room. I realized that Lost Sanctuary had launched a real attack on the complex, and I had only a few minutes to complete the mission and escape. I reconnected to the server and waited for Project SIN to finish downloading. The file was enormous, almost a terabyte of data on experiments, technical specifications, and test subject lists. Once the download was complete, I quickly erased all traces of my presence in the system and headed for the emergency exit. The complex's ventilation system included an emergency tunnel leading to the surface. Lost Sanctuary had studied Babel's blueprints in advance and found this escape route. The passage was narrow and awkward, but it allowed them to bypass all the checkpoints and escape undetected. While I was crawling through the ventilation shafts, actual combat was taking place within the complex. Explosions shook the building, and bursts of machine gun fire and screams could be heard. Lost Sanctuary hadn't attacked Babel to capture it. It was a diversionary operation designed to buy me time to complete the main mission. After half an hour of crawling through narrow tunnels, I finally emerged onto the surface. A full-scale battle raged around the complex. Lost Sanctuary soldiers had taken up positions in the hills surrounding Babel and were shelling the building with heavy weapons. Praetorians returned fire with energy cannons, their shots leaving molten craters in the ground. The air was thick with smoke, sparks from explosions, and the smell of burning metal. I watched as Assault Team Leader Rolf coordinated the attack via radio. His squad covered my retreat, risking their lives for the mission's success. Elijah, a young man who dreamed of becoming an engineer, was blown up by a mine while attempting to plant explosives at the main entrance. I will remember his scream for the rest of my life. Not so much from the pain, but from the realization that he wouldn't live to see the world change. The other soldiers fell one after another. The Praetorians were nearly invulnerable to small arms fire, their armor able to withstand direct hits from grenade launchers. Only surface-to-air missiles could penetrate their defenses, but the Lost Sanctuary had limited such ammunition. Every shot had to be precise and deadly. Rolf received the order to retreat. The evacuation ship Phoenix was already in the air and could take the surviving soldiers. Squads Dingo and Coyote were the first to withdraw, covering their wounded comrades. Viper and Adler were to remain until the last, providing cover for the rest. Everyone had 5 minutes before they were ready to withdraw. I ran toward the evacuation point, clutching the drive containing the stolen data. Explosions thundered behind me. Lost Sanctuary was detonating its equipment to avoid leaving any evidence. A ship appeared ahead, its ramps already lowered for a quick landing. The pilots nervously checked their instruments. Every second of delay increased the risk of detection by corporate patrol ships. Rolf was the last to reach the Phoenix. His left arm hung limply, and his face was covered in soot and blood. But he continued to command the retreat until the very end. When the ramps closed and the ship rose into the air, he finally allowed himself to fall to the floor and close his eyes. Less than half of his squad survived. The flight to the Lost Sanctuary base passed in silence. Everyone thought about their fallen comrades, wondering if the mission was worth the sacrifice. I looked out the window at the receding earth and thought about Lisa. Now I knew the truth about her death. She wasn't just a victim of corruption, but also a person who unconsciously resisted attempts to control her mind. Douglas met me at the base. He looked exhausted. The operation had cost the organization dearly, but the results had exceeded all expectations. The information I'd stolen was priceless. Evidence of corruption, schemes to defraud colonists, data on organ trafficking. All of it was enough to destroy Illuminus's reputation and draw attention to the problems of the remote colonies. But Project SIN was a real bombshell. Mind control technology, human experiments, plans to create a docile population. It was a scandal that could shake the entire solar system. If this information became public, people would realize how deeply the corporations had infiltrated their lives. Douglas said the data would be shared with independent journalists, human rights organizations, and representatives of colonial governments. Simultaneously, Lost Sanctuary was planning a series of attacks on other Illuminus facilities to prevent the corporation from concealing or destroying evidence. The war was just beginning. In the following weeks, information from Project SIN did indeed leak to the media. First, isolated articles in independent publications, then detailed investigations by major news channels. The public was shocked by the scale of the experiments and the cynicism of the corporate plans. Protests, strikes, and demands for an investigation erupted. Illuminus tried to deny the accusations, dismissing them as fabrications by competitors. Corporate lawyers claimed the stolen documents were forged and Project SIN was a science fiction hoax. But the evidence was too overwhelming and the details too precise to be dismissed. The Sol government was forced to launch an official investigation. The Scientific Ethics Committee demanded the release of all documents related to human experiments. Illuminous shares plummeted on the intergalactic stock exchange. Partners began breaking contracts, and employees resigned, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. But victory came at a high price. Lost Sanctuary lost many people in the operation against Babel. The families of the fallen fighters were left without breadwinners, and the wounded required lengthy treatment. Corporate security began an active hunt for the organization's members, using any means necessary to capture them. They were looking for me too. Babel's surveillance cameras captured my face, albeit in a distorted form. Illuminous forensics gradually reconstructed my true identity, analyzing my gait, gestures, and behavioral patterns. Douglas said it was unsafe to remain at the base. I'd have to change my appearance again and go deep underground. The new plastic surgery made me even more unrecognizable. I was now Marcus Weber, a truck driver who transported cargo between colonies. This job allowed me to be constantly on the move, without having to stay in one place for long. Moreover, the transport corridors were ideal for transmitting information between lost sanctuary cells. Months turned into years. The Project Sign investigation dragged on due to opposition from corporations and corrupt officials. Many key witnesses disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Documents were lost, and experts changed their conclusions under pressure. Illuminous used all its influence to hush up the case. Meanwhile, mind control experiments continued, but in a more covert form. The corporation moved its research to secret bases in remote areas of the galaxy where international human rights treaties did not apply. New victims were recruited from among refugees, the homeless, and the undocumented, those whose disappearance would not alarm anyone. Lost Sanctuary also evolved. From a small group of Avengers, it grew into a veritable resistance network with thousands of supporters across the solar system. Journalists, scientists, politicians, ordinary workers, more and more people realized that corporations had turned humanity into a commodity to be traded. New operations became increasingly daring. Lost Sanctuary hacked corporate networks, liberated test subjects from secret labs, and published compromising information about top executives. Each operation resulted in casualties on both sides, but there was no alternative. This was the only way to stop the corporate terror machine. I participated in several such operations, using the skills I'd acquired in preparation for the Babel mission. Infiltrating a research facility on Titan where memory experiments were being conducted. Freeing a group of children from a clandestine laboratory on Ceres where they were being trained to have control devices implanted. Destroying a nanoparticle production facility on an asteroid. I always thought about Lisa, about what she would have said about this war. She was a kind person who wanted to help people, not harm them. But sometimes, to protect good, you have to use force against those who would destroy it. My daughter would understand this. After all, her own body resisted the corporation's invasion until her dying day. A breakthrough occurred 3 years after the Babel operation. One of the leaders of Project Scene, Dr. Amelia Richards, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for protection and immunity from prosecution. She provided complete data on the experiments, lists of all project participants, and patterns of nanoparticle distribution via medications. Her testimony was a turning point in the investigation. Now investigators had not only the stolen documents, but also a living witness who could explain every detail of the project. Dr. Richards described how Illuminous's top management personally approved the experiments, how the victims were selected, and how the results of unsuccessful experiments were concealed. The trial of Illuminous's management became the trial of the century. Corporation representatives attempted to shift responsibility to individual employees, claiming they were unaware of the scale of the experiments. But the evidence was irrefutable. Meeting notes, financial documents, and correspondence between top managers. The entire corporate control system was laid bare for all to see. The sentence was harsh. Several dozen executives received life sentences. The corporation was ordered to pay multi-billion-dollar compensation to the victims of the experiments, and all mind control research was officially banned. Illuminous ceased to exist as a corporation. Its assets were sold, and its divisions were transferred to other companies. But most importantly, public attitudes toward corporate power changed. People realized that without oversight and restrictions, corporations were willing to turn humanity into expendable material for their experiments. New human rights laws were passed, independent commissions were created to oversee scientific research, and requirements for medical drugs were tightened. The colonies gained greater autonomy and rights. The central government was forced to revise the supply system and provide genuine support to remote settlements. Corruption in the transport sector was virtually eradicated thanks to new systems of oversight and transparency. Lost Sanctuary announced its dissolution after achieving its main objectives. Most members returned to normal life, receiving amnesty in exchange for cooperating with investigators. Some remained underground, continuing to monitor the activities of the remaining corporations and ready to rejoin the fight if necessary. Douglas died a year after the trial ended. He developed cancer due to constant stress and poor living conditions underground. His last words were a wish that the children of the future would never have to know what corporate slavery was. Hundreds of people attended his funeral, former colonists, journalists, politicians, and ordinary citizens whom he had saved from becoming guinea pigs. Rolfe opened a self-defense school on Mars, where he taught young people how to defend themselves against corporate tyranny. He argued that the world had changed for the better, but we must be prepared for the possibility that greed and power would once again attempt to enslave humanity. His students studied not only combat skills but also the history of the struggle for freedom, lest they repeat the mistakes of the past. I, too, tried to return to normal life. I changed my appearance again, this time returning to my true face. I settled on a small colony in the asteroid belt, where I did the same thing I had done before the tragedy with Lisa, repairing and maintaining mining equipment. But the world was already different, and I too had changed. Independent medical centers now operated in the colonies, equipped with the best equipment and medications. The transportation system was reorganized to ensure the reliable delivery of vital supplies. Each shipment was tracked using blockchain technology, eliminating the possibility of corruption or theft. Children in the colonies could once again dream of a future without fear of becoming victims of corporate experiments. They studied science and art, preparing to become doctors, engineers, and researchers. The world we had fought for had finally become a reality. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, I thought about the price of this victory. About Lisa, who never lived to see better times. About the fallen fighters of Lost Sanctuary, who gave their lives for the freedom of others. About Dr. Richards, who found the courage to admit her mistakes and help bring justice. About all the victims of Project SIN, whose broken lives could never be restored. The information I stole from Babel's servers continued to reveal new secrets. Investigators uncovered connections between Illuminus and other corporations, evidence of an international conspiracy to control human consciousness. It turned out that experiments were being conducted not only on Earth and in the colonies, but also on other planets where humanity was just beginning to settle. A secret base was discovered on Proxima Centauri, where hundreds of colonists were subjected to memory-altering experiments. They were implanted with false memories of a happy life on Earth to suppress the desire to return home. The people worked in conditions akin to slavery, but considered themselves fortunate and grateful to the corporation for the opportunity. A network of laboratories operated on Jupiter's moons, where children were raised from an early age to be ideal corporate employees. They were implanted with devices that suppressed creative thinking and critical perception of reality. These children were intended to become a new generation of humanity, obedient, predictable, and easily manipulated. Even on Mars, considered a bastion of human freedom and independence, traces of experiments were discovered. Corporations added nanoparticles to water and food, gradually altering the behavior of residents of large cities. People became less prone to protest, more loyal to authorities, and willing to work for lower wages. Each new discovery revealed how deeply corporations had penetrated humanity. They weren't simply robbing and exploiting people. They were attempting to alter the very nature of human consciousness, to create a new species of intelligent beings who would be incapable of resisting corporate power. But the resistance was stronger than the corporations had anticipated. The human spirit, the desire for freedom and justice, proved unconquerable by any technology. Even those subjected to experiments gradually regained their true identities, freeing themselves from imposed beliefs. Treating the victims of Project SIN became one of the main goals of the New World Order. Specialized rehabilitation centers were created where people could restore their memory, personality, and critical thinking abilities. The process was long and painful. Many could not accept the truth that their lives had been a lie imposed by corporations. Some victims preferred to remain in their illusions. For them, the real world was too cruel after the artificial happiness created by nanoimplants. Society was forced to create special reservations where these people could live in their altered memories without harming themselves or others. Children raised in corporate labs required special attention. Many of them didn't know the meaning of family, friendship, or love. Their emotions were suppressed by implants, and their social skills were limited to following orders. It took years of therapy to teach them how to be human. I often volunteered at such rehabilitation centers. My experience of losing my daughter and fighting corporate abuse helped victims believe their suffering wasn't in vain. I told them Lisa's story, how her body resisted attempts at control until her last breath. This gave them the strength to fight for their true selves. One such victim was a girl named Anna. She was the same age as Lisa at the time of her death. Anna grew up in a laboratory on Europa where she was taught to be happy serving the corporation. Her memory was completely erased and replaced with false memories of loving parents, researchers who supposedly cared for her well-being. When Anna was released, she didn't understand why she was being separated from her family. She screamed, cried, and tried to return to the lab. For her, it was the only home she'd ever known. It took a long time to explain the truth about her past. Gradually, Anna's memory began to recover. She recalled her real name, Maria, and her birth parents, who were killed when she was 5. She remembered being taken away by people in white coats who promised to show her a better world. She remembered the pain of the first surgeries to implant nanodevices, the fear, and the loneliness. Working with these children, I realized that Project SIN wasn't just a mind control experiment. It was an attempt to create a new humanity, obedient, predictable, and devoid of the ability to resist. The corporations planned to replace the natural process of personality development with artificial programming, turning people into biological robots. If we hadn't managed to stop this project, within a few generations, humanity would have lost everything that makes us human. Creativity, love, the pursuit of justice, all of this would have been erased in the name of corporate efficiency. The world would have turned into a vast factory where human robots would have produced profits for their masters. But we won. Not without losses, not without sacrifices, but we won. Humanity retained its freedom and dignity. Children could once again grow up in real families, dream of the future, and choose their own path in life. Corporate tyranny was broken, and people were given a chance at true happiness. Today, many years later, I look at the stars and think about the world we are leaving for our descendants. It's not a perfect world. It still has problems, conflicts, and injustice. But it is a world where people are free to be themselves, where corporations serve society rather than the other way around, where every child can grow up as a human being, not a commodity. Lisa's memory lives on in every saved child, in every prison colony that received timely medical care, in every family that wasn't destroyed by corporate greed. Her death wasn't in vain. It became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that the human spirit is stronger than any technology of control. Lost Sanctuary no longer exists as an organization, but its spirit lives on in the hearts of millions across the galaxy. We have learned to be vigilant, to not allow power and wealth to enslave humanity again. We remember the lessons of the past and are ready to defend freedom at any cost. Information from Project SIN is still being studied by scientists and historians. It serves as a warning of the extent to which human cruelty can reach when power and technology combine against ordinary people. This data is being used to develop new methods of defense against psychological influence and to teach future generations to recognize and resist attempts at mind control. Every year on August 19th, humanity celebrates Liberation Day, in memory of those who died fighting corporate tyranny and in honor of those who found the courage to speak the truth. On this day, people gather, tell stories of the past, and promise to never forget the lessons of history. I always visit Lisa's grave on this day. I tell her about how the world has changed, about the children we saved, about the future made possible by her sacrifice. Sometimes I think I hear her voice. Quiet, kind, full of pride that her father didn't give up and fought to the end. The world we live in today is far from perfect, but it is a world where every person has a chance at happiness, where children can dream of a future without fear of becoming victims of others' greed. It is a world worth fighting for. And if human freedom is ever threatened again, if corporations or governments attempt to turn people into commodities, there will be those who stand in their way. Because the memory of Project SIN, the victims of corporate experiments, and the struggle of Lost Sanctuary will forever remain in the hearts of humanity. We are free, and we will remain free as long as we remember the price of this freedom.